So today's daf is Ayin Aleph, and we'll start here on daf Ayin Omid Beis. We left off with a machlokes between Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda, but the Gemara finds it necessary uh, to put this machlokes into a different framework, and that's what we're going to do now. Ella I Itmar. So we're going to count up here. Um, let's see, one, two, three, five lines up from the bottom of Ayin Omid Beis. So this machlokas between Rabbi Yonah, and Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavta has to explain the following way: a Sefer Itmar. So we're going on the Sefer of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says in Mishrisho Kodem LaOmer HaOmer Matiron, which means that if the planted grains took root, which is a 3-day process, before the Omer on the 16th, then the Omer is matir that. You don't have to wait till the next Omer. This Omer itself makes it into Yoshan. And now we have machlokas between Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavta. My kodem la Omer, meaning how much before the Omer. And there are two parts to the Omer. There's the Karban HaOmer, which is on the 16th by day, and then there's the Ktsiras HaOmer, that's the night going into the 16th. So according to Rabbi Yonah, Kodem Havas HaOmer. So you need already 3 days before the 16th when the Omer is brought, 16th by day, whereas Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda says Kodem Ktsiras HaOmer, which is the night before. So then you're going to have to start the Hashrosha 3 days before the night before in order for the Omer to be matir. And this is where we stopped yesterday. So now the Gemara is going to quote Rabbi Elazar, in order to find a source for the halacha of Hashrosha. We've been assuming for a long time now that the planted grains, although they didn't yet develop, and we don't see anything, everything is going on subterranean, so to speak. Nevertheless, the Omer is matir. How do we know this? Omer Rabbi Elazar. Now we start at Da. Rabbi Yoshia did Dori. Now there were two Rabbi Yoshias. There was the Tana Rabbi Yoshia, and then there was a Rabbi Yoshia Namora who was a contemporary of Rabbi Elazar. And the language that we'll see Rabbi Elazar employs right now would not be appropriate to speak to a Tana. Anyway, lo tesev akaret, don't even sit down on a chair. Ad debefarshalei lahamas, until you explain this Mishnah. Minayin la omer shemater bashrosh. What's the source in the Torah from which the Mishnah derives the conclusion that once there was Hashrosha and the grains took root before the Omer, then that's enough to be matir those grains? Minolan. So let me just give an example. In the wintertime, we assume that the planting of what's being harvested in the winter already took place before last Omer, meaning last Nisan, a year ago. So that's why for most of the winter, we don't have a problem of Chadash. The real problem of Chadash begins, let's say, in February, March, April, as we get closer and closer to Pesach, because it could be that which we're seeing in the market, let's say around March time, was planted after Pesach. It was, let's say, a spring crop. Minola. Dichsiv Aviv, right? The Torah describes the ears of grain as Aviv, which means they're ripened. Lav, Michlal De'ika, de Lav Aviv. Apparently there's other grains that would also be permitted that are not yet ripe. Okay, they're not yet ripe, but the Gemara says the lav of liolam dial shlish. Maybe they're not yet ripe, but they've already developed to a more advanced stage, which is called shlish, where in Zroim, the halacha usually depends on havah shlish. So again, you're going to have to find another source that even before havah shlish, the omer could be matir. El omer Shmuel mehachel chermesh. So the pasuk is telling us that the grains that we use for the omer have to be fit for ktsira. Lav mechlal, shouldn't we derive from that the ika de lav bar chemish? That's something which is not fit to be cut down, and yet it's included in the omer such that the omer could be materit. Okay, the Gemara still is not happy. De lav bar chemish liom shachas. Maybe it means it's not something that you could cut down with a sickle because it's still very, very advanced. It's very early in the stage of development, and it's at the stage of shachas. Shachas is what they cut down from the field as animal fodder. Omer Rabbi Yitzchak, kama. The Torah says kama. It means that the omer has to be brought from kama, which means standing crop, and the implication is that there's something that's not even standing because it hasn't even grown above the ground, and yet the omer is matir, lav michal de lav bar kama. Okay, the Gemara is still not happy. De lav bar kama uli olam agam. Agam means that you could take it and bend it, so it's really just coming out of the ground. It's a very small growth. It's at a very early stage, but again, it's way beyond Hashrosha. Elam Rava says Asher Tizra. There are two words that are extra in the pasuk Asher Tizra. It says Chag Hakatzir Bikurei Masech Asher Tizra Basodeh. And what is this ribuy of Asher Tizra? Mishas Zriya. So Zriya means it's something as early as Zriya. Now, as we'll see from Rav Papa in a minute, if we take Rava literally, then as soon as you plant it, even if it hasn't reached the Ashrosha, which will take another 72 hours, it's already subject to the matir of the Omer. According to your logic, let's go even back earlier to the point in which it was just planted and it didn't even take root. Amalei Sudarni. Sudarni is a nice compliment when you say to a person that he's a scholar. Basadeksiv. The word basadeh tells me that the matir of the Omer could only relate to something that's already connected to the Sodah. Now, when you put a seed into the ground, all right, it's physically in the ground, but nothing has happened. You could just pull it out of the ground. So there's no connection of bas soda between the zriya and the soda. When do we clinch that relationship, that connection between the zera, the seed, and the soda? That's called hashrosha. As soon as it takes root, and now it could begin to grow, that's when the seed is connected to the soda. Now we're up to the Mishnah. Kotrin beis hashalchin shebamokim. Let's say by introduction that there are many, many places in Eretz Yisrael where there's growth and there's planting and reaping, but it's not roy for the carbon mincha of the Omer. And therefore the Iser Ktsira, which prohibits me to cut down the new growth before I've cut down the Omer, that will only apply where if I would be cutting down that which could be brought for the Omer. But if it's not suitable for the Omer, then it's not included in the Iser Ktsira. And therefore, Beis HaShalchin, which are irrigated fields Sheba'amakim, these fields are low down in valleys, and apparently the rain doesn't really reach down in the valleys, through the mountains and so forth and so on without irrigation. And the growth, the plants that grow in this place, maybe it's very dark as well, are second fiddle. They're inferior quality, and we don't take them for the Omer. And therefore, we're going to allow the people to reap these grains even before we've brought the Omer. Avalo Godshin, but we don't want to go too far. We're not going to allow them to cut down the grains and pile them up in what's called a Godish. Because once they get involved in that, you never know if they might start eating it, and it's also midin chadash. So again, we're saying you're allowed to cut it down, but it's still also b'achila midin chadash. Anshe Yericho, we're going to have a lot to talk about the Jerichoians, or the people from Jericho at that time. They went ahead and they did number one ktsira down in these saros Beis Hashalchin Shabamokim, but they also did Gedisha. They went one step further. So the Mishnah comments that Kotzum Ritzon Chacham, the Chacham were okay with the fact that they cut down and harvested this, the grains in the Amokim. But Godshim, when they went ahead a step further, they started piling it up and tying it into bundles. That's Shalom Ritzon Chachamim, but V'lo Michu Biyadam. The Chachamim did not make a big deal out of it. Apparently, the Anshe Yericho felt that they would be very careful and not to eat Menachos. They didn't eat Menachos for the entire winter, and they're waiting for the Omer, so they would not be tempted to eat from the crops that they're piling up in these Godishes. So therefore, the Chachamim said, you know what, we'll look the other way and we'll let it go by. The Mishnah says the following. What about shachas? Shachas is something that's cut down for the purpose of feeding the animals in a very early stage. His kotzel is shachas machil behim. He's allowed to cut down the shachas, even though they haven't yet cut the omer, because shachas is not something that you bring on the mizbeach as a minchas ha'omer. Omer Rav Yehuda Masai, bisman shemaschil ad shelo hevi shlish. Meaning you have to start the process of reaping the shachas for the sake of the animals before the plant reaches a shlish. Once it reaches a shlish, it's already roy for the mizbeach for the karban minchas ha'omer, and therefore you're not allowed to cut down. Now the implication seems to be that if he started cutting it down before it reached shlish, and until he got to the point where he could reap the entire field, there were many, many plants that reached shlish. Nevertheless, since he started, we're going to allow him to finish. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Yiktzar v'yachil af mishahevi shlish. So Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that even after the plants reach the shlish, nevertheless, you're allowed to cut them down because it's still very early in the development, and at this point, it would not be roy for the Omer. So even though the grain had already attained a third of its growth, but the reaping here at this early stage, that's not being done for human consumption. That's being done for the animal, and therefore it's not called a harvest. What does that mean? It doesn't have a shem ktsira, and the Torah prohibits a ktsira before the ktsira of the Omer. But this is not a ktsira. Why isn't it ktsira? Because it's done at this early stage for the sake of feeding the animals. Mishnah continues, the kotzrim mipnei netios. Now, when they planted very young saplings, then between each sapling, there were grains that were growing. So you have ilonos, which are young saplings in this case, and you have grains. The grains are sort of spread out between the various young saplings, these trees. Now, keep in mind that we have two reasons why we would take out these grains and harvest them, even though the Omer hasn't been cut down yet. One reason is because these grains weaken the karka, they suck up the nutrients, and it's going to have a damaging effect on the ilonos. The other explanation is that we're dealing with the problem of kilayim, because any mixture of grains with fruits on the tree is kilayim. So therefore, when he reaps it, he's doing it l'shem mitzvah, to avoid the iser kilayim, and that was not included in the iser ktsira before the ktsira sa'omer. Next, mipnei beis ha'avel. Now, if I understand correctly about beis ha'avel, then there was something called a sudas havra, which was the first meal they gave to the avel after the kvura. And it was a very big public happening. And right outside the cemetery, there was no place to put chairs because the growth of the crop was interfering. So we're going to allow you to cut it down before the harvesting of the Omer for the sake of the mitzvah of Sudas Havra. And a similar halacha is when they bitul beis hamedrash, meaning if, let's say, they wanted to bring the Talmidim, as they often did, out to the fields where there was an open area and they would hear Torah and so forth and so on, but they wanted the Talmidim to sit on chairs, and it was very difficult to sit on chairs because of the growth. They allowed them to cut it down before the Omer in order to facilitate the sitting down on chairs and hearing the Torah. So that's again called a ktsira shel mitzvah. And a ktsira shel mitzvah does not qualify as a ktsira that undermines the ktsira of the Omer as being the first ktsira. However, lo yasa osam krichos. In other words, in all these cases that we spoke about, and this was called the gadish that we mentioned earlier, we're going to allow you to cut it down, but don't start piling it up into bundles, because then you might be tempted to eat menachos. Al menicham tzvasim. What you're allowed to do is you can put them, just lay them one on top of the other, all these stalks and grains, but don't tie them into bundles. Mitzvah sa'omer lovo min hakama. So the real lechatchila mitzvah of bringing the Omer is that you bring it from kama, meaning kama means that the harvesting is done l'shem mitzvahs ha'omer. Lo matzah, but there was nothing to be found, meaning all the grains of barley were already harvested. Is yavi min omer, then in a second tier possibility, even the cut barley sheaves are okay. Mitzvah salav in alach. If all is ideal, then you want to get the moist kernels that have perfect freshness. But lo matzu, he doesn't find anything, then yavi yavish. Mitzvah elixir balayla. The mitzvah of ksir ha'omer is by night. And it's very interesting because Firas ha'omer also starts at night. So it sounds like we're not counting the Havas HaOmer, which is the next morning, but rather the Ktsiras HaOmer, which is at night. So when is the first counting this year of the Omer? It would be next Thursday night. Does that make sense? Right? Wednesday night is the Seder, or Thursday night? Yeah. I think Wednesday night is the Seder, and then Thursday night we start counting the Omer, even though the Omer wouldn't be brought until Friday morning. Nixabayo. They did not do the Ktsir at night, they did it by day, and now he wants to use that barley that he harvested for the Omer, is kosher. It's okay. V'doches HaShabbos. If the 16th of Nisan overlaps with Shabbos, then Ktsiras HaOmer will override the Shabbos. Gemara says the following, Tanya, we learned in a Bryce. Rabbi Binyamin Omer, Kosev Echan Omer, Uktsartem es Ktsira, Vavesem es HaOmer. So it would seem that the Ktsira comes first, and then the bringing of the Omer comes second. That means you're allowed to do the Ktsira See, the Gemara now is assuming that Vevesem es HaOmer is not the actual Hakrova, but Vevesem es HaOmer is referring to the harvesting of the Omer. And therefore, when the Torah says, Uktsartem is ktsira. It's allowing you to do your ktsira even before the ktsira sa'omer. But that's not so, because ksiv, we have another pasuk that says, Reishis ktsira chamel kohen. The first thing that you harvest is got to be the omer, the barley, the sheaves of barley for the omer. Okay, said, how do we reconcile this? In other words, apparently there are situations in which you're allowed to cut down the grains even before the omer was cut. HaKetzad? And the answer is Mimakom Shata Mevi Iato Kotzi. Mimakom She'iato Mevi Mimakom She'iato Kotzer is just one more time, sorry. Mimakom Shata Mevi Iato Kotzer. Mimakom She'iato Mevi Iato Kotzer. So if you are cutting down grains of barley that would not be brought for the omer, then you're allowed to cut them down even before the ktsir. Okay. And that would explain again the Mishnah that we spoke about in terms of what was it called? The Amokim, Beis HaShalkin Shabamok. So Gemara now asks the following question. Ema, you had a steer between two psukim. I can reconcile them. There are 5 species of grains. Only one of them is kosher for the omer, and that's barley, sa'ora. So now we're saying that since the other grains of wheat and spelt and rye and what did I leave out? Whatever it is that are not designated or not valid for the omer, then you're allowed to cut them down. That would be the simplest way. But the Gemara says, no, that we cannot accept. Who lo motzis, we couldn't accept that interpretation, that reconciliation. Why? Mid Rabbi Yochanan. Because Rabbi Yochanan had Xeris Shava, rachis, that we learned on the previous daf, and we derive from chala, where it says rachis, and we equate that by analogy to the rachis ktsirchem of the omer, that just like chala applies to all 5 species of grain, so too the rachis of the omer applies to all 5 species. So again, what it means is that you cannot cut down any of the 5 species, even though only one of those 5 can be used on the mizbeach as the minchas omer. Now we get to the Anshe Yericha. And it says, Man shamet le di omar. The language here of the Mishnah differentiates between michu and lo michu, meaning definitely the first level was okay, and the Rabbanan have no compunctions about it, which would mean the ktsir itself. But the second level, where he went as far as Gedisha, as Gadish, that's against the will of the Chachamim, but lo michu biyad. So the Gemara says that whole distinction really depends upon a machlokes between the Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, this Mishnah must be attributed to Rabbi Yehuda. And why is that so? Because it's Rabbi Yehuda arguing against the Chacham, as we'll soon see, with regard to michu or lo michu. He's the one who takes that approach. Besav Rabbi Yehuda, the only problem is that when we see Rabbi Yehuda's distinction between michu and lo michu, we're going to find out that Ktsira Dianshe Yericha B'Ratzon Chacham that it's really not true. Rabbi Yehuda was not happy with the fact that the Anshe Yericha went ahead and they cut down the grains. But Tanyas, we have in a brisa. Now the brisa begins with the shita of the Chachamim, and then continues with the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Shisha dvarim also Anshe Yericha, shlosha b'ratzon Chachamim, shlosha shelo b'ratzon Chachamim. Okay, so this is the shita of the Tanakama. Elu b'ratzon Chachamim, markivim dekolim kol hayom. So now we're dealing with Erev Pesach. In the afternoon of Erev Pesach, there was an Iser Malach Midrabban. And in Yericho, they were Mekil, and they allowed grafting palm trees. Now, the grafting of palm trees apparently is not a big deal. It doesn't require a great deal of tircha. So, although technically it's a malacha and it should be prohibited on Erev Pesach after Chatzos, but um, nevertheless, biratzon chacham. The chacham said it's okay. And why is that? Because the Isa malacha on the Erev Pesach is only malacha sheyesh ba tircha. And grafting palm trees, apparently what they did was they would inject into the palm a solution that was made of other plants, very sophisticated. And it resembles grafting. Anyway, it doesn't require an aggressive amount of work, and therefore we'll let it go by. Next, Kochen Shema. You say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and immediately you say V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, without any break in the middle. We are knowing a break in the middle. We say Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuso, but in Jericho they didn't have time for that. But that's fine, because that's the way you should say Kriyat Shema. I mean, we have Baruch Shem, but Kotzim Lifnei Omer. Now, what's going on over here? It says Kotzim Lifnei Omer Bertzon Chachamim. They would allow the ktsira of the new grains before the Omer was cut. So again, it's going to have to be, as we'll see it develops with Rabbi Meir and so forth, that we're dealing with an early stage of development. The Elu and the other three, Shelo b'ratzon Chacham, were against the view of the Chachamim, Godshim Lifnei Omer, that not only were they harvesting grains from the new crop before the Omer, they were even piling it up. Matirin Gamzios Shel Hegdesh Shel Charuv Shel Shikma. Now, this is an interesting thing about generations, that the older generation would plant branches of charuvim and shikma. These are carob trees and sycamore trees that last a long, long time. And they designated it for the Migdash as what we call Kedushas Dom. But the next generation would enjoy the benefit of these branches of carob and sycamore trees, because they said that our parents and grandparents, when they were magdish it for the gizbar, they were only magdish the trunk of the tree, but not the branches of the tree. And it was Shelo b'ratzon Chacham. The Chacham really understood that the parents, grandparents had designated the entire tree from tip to toe, including its fruits for the Migdash. Then partzin pratzos begagoseyen uveparsehen. They would breach the fences of their gardens and their orchards on Shabbos, and then not on Shabbos, but before Shabbos. Kidei lahachil nishar la'aniyim. What happens is that you've got trees, and some of the fruits fall off the trees on their own without being harvested. So these tzaddikim in Yericho would say, you know what? We want the poor people to come in and take these fruits that fell from the tree. That's called nesher. They fell from the tree. And it was a shnei batzores. It was a famine year, and the anim was starving. And they allowed this to go on, inviting, so to speak, the aniyim to come into their orchards, their fields on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Divrei Rabbi says, we're not happy with that, because once they start on Shabbos and Yom Tov picking up the apples that fell from the tree, they'll be tempted to grab an apple, a low-hanging apple on Shabbos. Amalo Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says, "Im b'ratzon chachamim osim." Right? You have the three cases where they allowed it. Is then, why are you telling me about Yericho? You call Adam Osim came. Why don't you just make a general statement that anybody could do this? Ella, therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda, I must conclude that Elu ve'elu shelo b'ratzon chachamim, that really the chachamim were not happy even about the first three, meaning they weren't so excited about this grafting on Erev Pesach and say it was no tircha, or combining, sandwiching the Shema Yisrael with the Vahavta and to do the Ketzir before the Omer. That was not the Ratzon Chachamim. Ella, Elu ve'elu lo b'ratzon chachamim, ve'al shlosha michu b'yom, ve'al shlosha lo michu yidam. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, the distinction here with regard to the Anshe Yericho was only whether or not the Rabbanu would go as far as to make a protest and force them, to stop doing this. Elu shalom michu biyadam. And now Rabbi Yehuda gives us the list of three things where, although l'chatchila the Chacham were not happy with it, but they didn't reprove the people, they didn't object to the people, and that's Markiva Dekolim Kol Hayom on Erev Pesach, Kolchin Es Hashma, and Kotzrim V'Gotzim Lifnei HaOmer. So they didn't make a mecha, even if they went that one step further, the Anshe Yericho, and they did Gadish, they piled it up. Ve'elu shemichu biyadam, right? We said that there were three violations where the Chachamim were so upset with what they did that they made a big mecha about it.